evidence do we have for a global flood? Remember, the people who resist on 6 days always are defensive about the flood. So we're going to look at these topics: Bible and the global flood, catastrophism. We're going to look at 2 models for the global flood. There are 3, but the third one, even I don't know how to explain, so I'm not going to try to. And there's a hydroplate flood model, there's a CPT flood model, catastrophic plate tectonics. There's fossils and strata, and then we're going to look at Jesus and the global flood. Okay? If it's not okay, too bad. No, I didn't mean that. I just mean that's what we're going to do. And I'll talk about these fossils a little bit. So this is in Joggins, Nova Scotia. Remember that tree I showed that was a strata tree? Okay, those are the cliffs that I was in. And you can see they're all tilted. It actually goes down 2 kilometers. So that's a lot of sediment. It's 2 kilometers deep. I mean, it was laid down horizontally. It wasn't laid like this. Laid down horizontally, and then it moved because of the continental crust. And so a lot of sediment was laid down during the flood and post-flood period. And of course, the Bible talks about a boat. Now let's take a look at what some things concerning the flood. First of all, here's your choices concerning the flood. If you're an evolutionist, the flood is a local flood or it's a myth. Okay? If you're a theistic evolutionist, then it's a local flood. It's just local. Black Sea type thing. And this was the position of St. Augustine, who had the day-age theory. It was the position of Schofield Bibles, and he developed the gap theory, the idea that there was a space of time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. And of course, progressive creationism, like Hugh Ross and Henri Blacher, they'll go for the local flood also, because they don't believe in the 6 days. So it just keeps on being a story, a myth. If you go into universities where they teach about the Bible, they'll say that there was a myth about origins that was passed down through the Sumerians and passed down through the Babylonians, and we just have a summary of what other people already had. That's what they say. That doesn't really hold up, and I'll explain that in a minute. So that's the progressive creationism. Now, there's a reason for that. You see, one of the things that challenged people as the Industrial Revolution was taking place, and you had all these canals going into England, right? You had all this canal system for moving coal and things up and down the country. Well, of course, they were digging through the strata, and they were finding all these fossils. And so they figured these fossils, they're all dead things, right? See, so you have this like fish, and this happens to be from Morocco, but you have this fish here. It's definitely dead, right? It's like 2 millimeters thick, but it's very identifiable. In fact, its cousin is there, and et cetera, et cetera. Very identifiable fish, but it's you can see, and it's been preserved. You don't see any degradation. This is very fast fossilization. And in fact, that's how we see all the fossils in the sedimentary rock. This is who knows what this is? What type of shell? I mean, it's more than a shell, it's the whole organism. Oyster, exactly. It's an oyster, and we'll talk about that a little long. Now, what's interesting about this oyster is that it's closed. So normally when an oyster dies, it opens like a clam or whatever. This didn't have time to open. But that's typical. It's very untypical to find the open ones because it's all flash, it's all fast. But they'll suggest that it's a long process and there were multiple local floods. And so this is where you have some background of this. Now the creationist position is that there was a global flood. Okay, and so the question is, if there's no reason for long ages, like we showed earlier on, what do you do with theistic evolution? Right? If you don't have the time, if the earth is young, that position doesn't even make any sense. So, interesting. So you have a global flood. Now, let's see what the Bible says. And God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, and for the earth is filled with violence through them," through flesh, through humans. "And behold, I will destroy them with the earth." Genesis 6:13. "And behold, I myself am bringing..." Now notice he says, "I myself." God clearly points it out that he is the one that is the author and in control of the flood. And all flesh means human and animal. Okay? "Behold, I myself am bringing flood waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die." Okay? Breath of life. Do fish breathe? No. Not in the sense of breathe the breath of life. Fish swim in water, so Noah doesn't have to take the fish on the ark. Okay, so just what breathes has to go on the ark. Okay, The fountains, now what happened? The fountains of the deep, great deep, were broken up, Genesis 7:11. The windows of heaven were opened up. It rained for 40 days, 40 nights. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth. Genesis 7:19. Then 7:20, the waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. Mountains were covered. Doesn't sound very local. All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, cattle, beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. That's pretty specific. All in whose nostrils was the breath or the spirit of life. All that it was on the dry land died. Now the flood lasted exactly 1 year and 11 days. Started in, they estimate, 17, like February or something. But actually, the whole idea, if I correct about this, the whole idea in November, Halloween and All Saints' Day is related to the flood day, what's considered to be the before and after the flood day. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. So this is very specific. This isn't like poetry or parable, or it's just God saying historically, this is what happened. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So the waters stuck around. In fact, it's possible the ark didn't start to float for 40 days. When we read the text, it doesn't look like the ark certainly didn't float right away. It took a while for the water to get up to where the ark was, and then it started floating, which has some very incredible implications. Next. So we see this flood story all around the world. Here we have a Babylonian flood story, and you can see the animals on the boat, right? And here we have a story from the Toltec Indians of ancient Mexico, and they talk about this box, and it means the closed chest. And so in fact, every tribe around the world talks about a flood. There are 238 stories. They don't all talk about Garden of Eden, but they all talk about a flood. Everybody in North America, we have whether it's the Hurons or the Mohawk or the Inuits, they all talk about a flood. I'll show you in a moment. Even the Hindu story, in Hinduism you have Vishnu, and it says, in the beginning the cosmic egg was surrounded by the infinite water of the great chaos. Inside there was Vishnu and 3 other gods and 4 goddesses. Oh, Noah had 3 sons, their wives. 8. 8 becomes really, really important. 8 is the significant, it means total. In Turkish, it means total. And that, in fact, it's so ingrained. We have a whole conference of this on French on the table, on how the story of the flood is ingrained in our cultures. It's even in French, and I think in English, we go back to the old German, 9, ou neuf, we say in French, means new. Everything starts new after the 8 people on the ark. And this is like, it's ingrained everywhere. Now, Vishnu, you get the nu from Noah. The earth was covered with water, and Vishnu Boar, I believe Boar, we'll see later, is probably the name of his wife, or close to the name of his wife, reestablished as it had, so he reestablished as it had been before. Now the 8 gods were born the first time from a mother's womb, and the second time from a cosmic egg, and the 7 gods were thankful for Vishnu. So, and they had the waters that was because of the result of the serpent with the 7 heads. And so you have this story, and of course Hinduism is extremely occult, but it has this, the flood story is there, and actually you can use this to evangelize when you talk about Vishnu and from the Rig Veda, and you tell them, well, actually that's not the real story, but it's strange. It's the story of Noah, and I've actually talked with a Hindu who is now a creationist. I haven't gotten him to become a Christian yet, but he is definitely now a creationist, so he's not a great Hindu. Now, even if we go to the Chinese language, we have an interesting situation. These are the modern characters for, if you combine these pictograms together, the vessel plus 8 plus mouth, that is the modern character for boat. And so here you have 8 mouths on a vessel means boat today in Chinese. So you ask them, why do you put 8 mouths on the boat? They have absolutely no idea. But when you create a language based on pictograms, and I have a whole conference on this, when you play language based on pictograms, everybody has to understand the same story. It's like Pictionary. If you ever played Pictionary, where you have to draw a picture and your team has to catch on, right? And so if you're playing with an Inuit and the word is house and he draws an igloo and you're going to lose because you don't have the same definition for house, right? So if you're going to make a language based on pictures, everybody has to know the same language. Now they don't know it anymore, and they have to sort of memorize the characters, and it makes it much, much more difficult to understand as a language, even for them, because they don't know the background or the roots of their own pictograms. But this is clear. This is 8 miles on a boat. Here's another one, for instance. Flood is you take total, which means 8, a group of 8 on the earth. That's total. The total with water is the symbol for flood. And so that's in their language today, and there's many examples of that. This is the $20 Canadian bill. It's the old bill. They just changed it to a new one now. That is the Haida. That's the the Inuit flood story. Of course, they changed the people. Well, you have Noah in the middle, and then you have the 7 creatures that all represent the different gods, the 7 animals. So again, this is really everywhere. It's really everywhere. For something that didn't happen, it's global. You see here, all these areas, China, India, Cree, Papua, Aztecs, Peru, they all have full representation of the biblical idea or partial representation. Basically, when you look at the universal destruction, it's all the way across. You look at destruction by water, it's 100% of the tribes talk about destruction by water. So for something that's local, it's strange that everybody's talking about it. Now, if you look at some things like human population, you have a very interesting situation. If we take this basis, which is a size of population after a lapse of time, so you get the final population, and so you have the SOP is the size of the original population, and then you have 1 plus C to the power of T, so you have C is the growth rate per year, T is the time in years, then what you have, if the worldwide population growth of 1.7%, that's really low, okay, you have a curve that looks like this, and that reaches 6 billion in 4,300 years. So in other words, if you take the world population as it is now and use the regular calculation used for calculating where we're going to be in the future, use that same number going backwards, you end up at 0 right around the time of the flood. If you started 1 million years ago, you'd have a real population problem, but not on Earth, in the universe, because there'd be more humans than atoms. That curve would go up way too fast. Okay, so population growth comes right back to the flood and shows that there was a flood where very few people were left. Now here's an interesting thing. If you look here, in the Bible it talks about how people lived hundreds of years, right? Even up to 1,000 years. So you have 930, then you have 912, 905, and you can see Enoch, Jared, and then you have Enoch, who's just 365. Methuselah lives right to the flood, right? And so you have all these people. Then you have Noah, who lives 960, 930 years. And then you have Shem, who lives 600 years, and then you have 3 generations of 400 after the flood, and then you have 3 generations of 200, and then things get lower, and even Abraham lived 175 years old, which is really old. Now, what's really interesting is if you look at this, Isaac can speak to someone who was on the boat. So this isn't a long verbal tradition. I personally think that Moses had tablets, 12 tablets, for writing the beginning of Genesis until he got to his part. So you had the tablet of, that's why you have the genealogies that show up. They define where the tablets start and stop. These genealogies that keep coming up. So you have the tablet of God and tablet of Adam and tablet of Seth, and so it goes down. So here's what's interesting here is, if you look at Nahor here, Nahor, he lives 150 years, which is pretty good. I would think 150 years is pretty good. Okay, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations are still alive above him. Not only are they alive, but they're young. He still has 150, 3 generations still have 150 years. The equivalent of what he has, his whole life, they're going to still live. So what do these people become? They become the gods of the mythologies around the world. They become the immortals because they're not dying. So they think they're immortal. Well, they don't necessarily think, but the people under them start thinking, these ancients are not dying. They must be immortal. They must be gods. And we start finding their names show up. And you can see even names in the Bible like Prometheus, the Greek god Prometheus. His father is Javan. Well, Javan's a name that's in the Bible. It's after the flood. And you can see these names start popping up, and you can find them in the mythologies. And I don't have time. That's a whole conference on its own. But it's just interesting to see that it's not a long tradition before Moses, and they could speak to people directly on the boat and find out how it was. Okay? So I thought that's sort of interesting. Many other things. Okay, so naturally the question people are going to ask, okay, there's a flood, where's the ark, right? Have we found the ark? Yeah, we keep finding it and keep losing it. So there's a website called nwcreation.net/noahsightings.html that has documented a lot of these findings where they say they've seen them. The ice goes in and out. It's on the mountains of Ararat, the Bible says. The waters returned from the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated in Genesis 8:3. 8:4, the ark rested on the 7th month and the 17th day of the month in the mountains, upon the mountains of Ararat. Not just the mountain of Ararat, but the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. And in the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. So this doesn't sound very local, does it? So what do we have? So this is where Turkey, so you have at the other end of Turkey, you have the Ararat. Just mention to you something. You know that Turkey is trying to join the European Common Market, right? You know that that's a disaster. That's a big disaster because of the number of Muslims in Turkey. Because you just instantly doubled the number of Muslims in all of Europe. And it becomes a really big major force. When I say it's a disaster, I have nothing against Muslims, but we do not have the same worldview. They, for some reason, think the kafirs are something to get rid of, and we're all kafirs if we're not Muslims. So that creates an issue with some of the ways the scriptures, the Muslim scriptures are interpreted. But that being said, this is the area, and this area is under a lot of combat area. It's a lot of zone where there's a lot of fighting, so it's a difficult area to go to, which is why people have trouble getting in and out to find the ark, and they've done that and the ice that keeps going up and down. These are all a whole list here of sightings of Noah's Ark. Okay, right from this 1970. So you have all these people who say they've seen on the Ararat area an ark or different structures. Okay, but technically, we do not, at this moment, we do not have an ark that you can say, let's go see the ark. Okay? I think God's sort of waiting for that, for a specific time, because you can imagine when the ark becomes, there's a lot of movies coming out about the flood. There's one, Russell Crowe is in one that's just coming out shortly that they've just invested a lot of money. It's not doing very well in the previewings, but that happens with films, and so I'm sure they'll correct it. But there's several films that are coming out, and there's one that has the flood happening in the future, which of course God says he will not do. So we've seen the Bible and the global flood, how it was described, where it was. Let's look at some evidence of flood. Is there such thing as catastrophism like a flood? Well, if we talk about here Harlan Bretz was basically laughed at for suggesting that there was a flood so big in North America that it created the dry falls. Now the dry falls, you've heard of Niagara Falls? Okay, we have this like horseshoe tape thing where, okay, well the dry falls would have been like a Niagara Falls, but 500 kilometers wide. Now, how far do you get 500 kilometers if you start in London? How far do you get? Do you get to Wakefield? You must get past Wakefield. Let's see, you're going north, Manchester, we're past Manchester. Newcastle? Newcastle. So think of a Niagara Falls that goes from London to Newcastle. That's a lot of water. That's a lot of water. And he was laughed at, and he said, this is what happened. There was this big lake, much bigger than the Great Lakes, and an ice broke. The ice broke, and it all ran out in one moment. It all ran out at once, and it cut through mountains, and it cut valleys, and it did. He estimated 1,600 cubic kilometers of water. It's almost unthinkable. 1,600 kilometers, 1,600 kilometers, 1,600 kilometers of water. Unthinkable. But it did this, and this is now recognized now. It dug these, right here, you can see a person on the top there. It dug these canyons instantly. The water was running at 80 kilometers an hour, it's estimated, 203 to 300 meters deep instantly. These are the dry falls. This is part of these falls that go 500 kilometers. They're called the dry falls, and they just took out all of it. The water just took it all. Here we have ripples. I don't know if it's lower, but here we have solidified ripples from currents. These ripples are 10 meters high. and they're solidified. The rock is solidified in the ripple format. This all happened with the Missoula flood. And so there is such thing as some really big catastrophes. Actually, even the Grand Canyon was cut by a water catastrophe from above. Water can really go through anything. Even the Antarctica talks about the drainage of subglacial lakes created canyons in the Antarctica 12 to 14 million years ago. Forget the years, but you see the picture there, and it looks exactly like, let me go back. So you see that picture? This is subglacial lakes, okay? So under the lakes, and if you look at this, it looks just like the Grand Canyon. It's water that cut this. This isn't like a little tiny river that did this. At any rate, the river would have to move, which is down here. The river would have to go uphill to do this, and rivers don't flow uphill. So this was cut as water was going downhill and just moved things out along the way and cut through all that strata. It cut down 1.6 kilometers. Now, if you have a local flood, it's going to look like this, which is a really bizarre situation. Right? It doesn't work. It's a local flood. He's out floating up there, and it's above the mountains locally. How did the water stop? It doesn't make any sense. So you want to know, where did it come from and where did it go? Where did the water come from and where did it go? So as I mentioned this morning, there is enough water on the earth now to cover it. If you look here, this is Jacques Cousteau who wrote, "Were the crust of the earth to be leveled, with great mountain ranges like the Himalayas and ocean abysses like the Mariana Trench evened out, no land at all would show above the surface of the sea. Earth would be covered by a uniform sheet of water more than 3 kilometers deep." There's lots of water out there. Lots of water. Now, Everest is interesting because at the top of Everest, you have Ordovician limestone. Ordovician means the type of fossils. And you have these ammonites that are at the top of Everest. Why? Because Everest was underwater. Now, Everest wasn't the height it is now when it was underwater, but all the mountains show exactly what we'd expect in a global flood. Fossils on the top of mountains. All the strata there. In fact, there's something that cut off the top of Everest, too, part of it. Okay, now let's look at the erosion. Let's do some simple calculations here. The erosion rate in the Himalayas is estimated to be 2.7 plus or minus 0.3 millimeters per year in the Himalayas. The lifting of the Himalayas is estimated to have started 50 million years ago. So let's do the calculation. At that rate, if this was true, 2.7 millimeters per year times 50 million years, you should have 135 kilometers of sediment. That is a lot of sediment. We don't even find the crust on the earth that thick anywhere. Where'd all the sediment go? So the problem here is probably the 50 million years, right? Okay, because this is you see the Everest up there, you see the Ordovician, and you can see it's just that all this sediment, see that yellow band at the top of each one? So that band went across the top. Where did all the sediment go? It's in the middle. How did it erode away? And they estimate, and just at its proper own erosion, it should produce kilometers of sediment. But that's not what we find on the Himalayas. Okay. So we've looked a little bit very quickly at some catastrophism. There's some examples, the Meluza flood, and there's the we were looking at fossils at the top of mountains, so I picked Mount Everest. Let's look at a couple of models that creationists have thought up in terms of what happened at the flood. Because the Bible doesn't say a lot. It says that the fountains of the deep opened and it started to rain, and it says the fountains of the deep closed and it stops raining. It would appear that there's a connection between the rain and the fountains of the deep. And so it might be that the waters that rained actually came from underground, and of course when they got up in the air, if they came from deep underground, they're very high pressure, they go up in the air and then they come down. But don't think of rain like we think of rain. This would be like mud, full of sediment, because it would have absorbed sediment on its way up. Very hot, very warm. And so Walter Brown, so there are a couple models. We don't know which is completely right. Every model has some imperfections in it. So this is still an area of work, but I'm just showing you what the situation is now at a very high level. I mean, this is a model that's 150 pages long. You can look it up on the internet on creationscience.com. He has a great book. It's free. You can just go out and read it. It's hundreds of pages. He has a section on the evidences for creation. He has a section in the middle on the hydroplate model, and then he has a section on the end that answers different questions about creation. Excellent book. And I like his model, and I think it does explain some things. I think there are a few other things that it doesn't explain, but that's fine. What he says is, if you notice the map of the world, we got these mountains. The largest mountains in the world are in the Atlantic. You got the biggest trenches in the world are in the Pacific. And of course, you have this form here that looks like it sort of matches where we get the plate tectonics idea. Now, he says, if you tried really to make plate tectonics work, he doesn't see it working very well because you have to get rid of Central America, you have to get rid of the Mediterranean, you have things that don't mesh. Now, some people might say, well, yeah, subduction might do it. It might, but it's not really a subduction area. So they sort of fit, but they don't fit that well. However, there is a way of making them fit, and that is to not try to put them together like that, but to leave them as if they were coming from where those mountains are. So if you line them up with the mountains, and then you have the continental crust, go back here, whoop, there, the continental crust. So you have that area where the continental shelf, I should say, not crust, the continental shelf comes out, and it sort of aligns up with the continental shelf and those mountains. So you bring them back to the mountains where things would have started. So his idea is this, that there would be water underneath, about 10 kilometers underneath the crust of the earth, there'd be water under extreme high pressure. Now, there is rock that's full of water in the earth. What was I reading recently? They discovered, I'm trying to think where, I'm pulling a blank because I've probably getting a little tired after a whole day of talking. There's a place where they found water, it's like an ocean that's held in the rocks. And in fact, yesterday in the papers, they were talking about rivers of water that are causing inundations in Europe. These rivers have as much water as the Amazon in the atmosphere. And they're causing inundations, they're causing drenching rain in Europe. But back to the ones underwater. So he's saying there are pillar-like structures that are forming and unforming because this is extremely high pressure. There's basalt here, there's the mantle here, and then you have, this was before the flood. You have some seas, you have some low mountains, but you have this water. Now what happens is, because this is under really, really high pressure, if you start, it's all one continent. If you start a crack, for whatever reason, a crack happens, that becomes a very weak point, and the pressure starts coming up, and these are the fountains of the deep. That's the way he says. Fountains of the deep open up. The water goes way, way up in the air, very hot. It absorbs the minerals. It's warm water, hot water. It's absorbing, and it's actually eroding the crust away like this, okay? And it's, of course, the rain, extreme rain is starting to fall, and it's falling very thick, and so it looks something like this. These are like 400 or 500 feet, maybe thousands of feet. And then what happens is the water is coming up and starts to flow over the top of the continents. As you know, it doesn't take very much water to do that, right? And so you have this water coming up, flowing over the continents, over the mountains. And what's going to happen here is that there's no more pressure holding the mantle down. So the pressure is going to start moving this up. And the tallest mountains in the world are actually in the Atlantic right here. And he said this is a crack that would actually go around the earth in about 2 hours when it happened. Whatever caused it, he doesn't actually look into what causes the event to start happening. But anyway, you have the Atlantic ridge that starts to form, and then the continents start moving. Because the big deal about continental movement, everybody agrees that the continents moved. Creationists have them moving underwater very quickly. Evolutionists have them moving very slowly, which creates problems. We saw there wasn't enough salt in the ocean, etc. But everybody has continents moving. The problem is, how do you move a continent? It's sort of heavy. And so the energy for moving continent is a question. So Walter Brown says, well, I move it by gravity. I keep water underneath, so it's actually sliding underneath and the water over it, and it's starting to move in both directions away from the mountains. And so he ends up with something like this, right? And then they start really moving quickly under the water, and you have the fractal zone, and there's many more things. Now, see, he would predict this kind of thing would happen, which is what we see in British Columbia. Remember that folding I showed in Switzerland? Here we have some really extreme folding in the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia. So this is what he would predict, and of course, there's many other things associated with, but that's the hydroplate water. So you have water come down. Eventually, there's no more water underneath, so things start abating, and the continents slow down. And for him, earthquakes that we have today are actually the latent energy of the global flood, still today. Leftover energy as the continents still move. See, one of the things he says is, if it was really rock on rock, he said they should cause a heat buildup. So where we have like a San Andreas fault or the different faults around the world, there should be a temperature rise where the faults are moving. Strangely, there is no temperature rise. So that's a sort of interesting situation where his model seems to fit some of the data. Also, there's a Coriolis effect. Now, you know what a Coriolis effect, I guess you could think of it when you let water out of your bathtub and you see the water turn around, okay? Basically caused by the rotation of the Earth. Well, there's a Coriolis effect that can be observed from the center of the Atlantic right through Europe. It's been published since 1996 in the Canadian Journal of Geology. And so how do you get this Coriolis effect if it's not a single event underwater from the center? So it's got some interesting aspects to it. I don't think it answers all the questions, but it does, it's an interesting idea. And it certainly addresses the question of the fountains of the deep coming up, right? And of course, I have these pictures we just saw earlier on. I won't spend any time. Oh, I didn't mention this last time. How much time do I have? A little bit of time. When I was in Chamazon, Switzerland, on our way up to get to where that mountain was that was so far away that I thought was close, we met these cows. And I figured Swiss people are sort of crazy because they leave the horns on the cows. I mean, I grew up on a farm. We cut the horns off for a really good reason. And we would never think of putting bells on all our cows. We don't think that's a good idea. Now, they explained to me that these cows are always in the mountains. They're always in the hills. And that they have, there are types of them that really get up in the hills. They're called the doudou. I may have that name wrong. But they said the thing about them is that they've been in the mountains so long that they actually have two legs that are shorter than the two other legs on this side. And so the way they catch them is they turn them around and then they sort of roll down to the bottom of the mountain. That's what the pastor told me, and I believe it. He really did tell me that, but I don't believe it. So then we have these strata folding that we talked about. Notice at the top here, you can see that. See the other events that happened after this happened. So after this is still underwater, and of course full of fossils. At the top, you can see other events are going across. They estimate if they follow the Alps, we're missing 80,000 feet. It's like a ridiculous amount of sediment is missing from the Alps. We don't know where it is. Well, I have a bit of idea, but they haven't really found it. So there's a lot of questions about this, about water and how it worked. Now, the second model I'm going to talk to you about is the CPT model, which is very popular with CMI, the group that's here. So some people take sides, I don't. Some people are like, some models better than others. They like the CPT model better. Its model, John Baumgartner's model, he's a very nice gentleman. He was actually saved in the campus with Campus Crusade for Christ. And he's a fantastic computer specialist. And he actually he's retired now, but he had the largest budget of any laboratory in the world for studying earthquakes in the world. And he had computer models that involved 30,000 cells, and he would do simulations. I'll show you one of them. So you have the Earth as a core, and then you have a mantle, and you have the Atlantic Ocean. You can see that rift there. So he's imagining this is what's going on. You have subduction here. You have plates that are going under. You have this thing coming up in the crust. So he's imagining some circulation. This is not water. This is more light, less dense magmatic rock. And so here's how it works. The oceanic plates can slide and sink into the mantle because they are cooler and more dense than the rock underneath. The rapid movement is due to the weakening of the rock in the mantle because of stress. So what he's saying here is you have this folding happening where things start dropping into the mantle very quickly, meters per second, because the plate is cool, less dense, and if it's just going to start just dropping. And then it comes up because as it goes down, it gets heated, and then it becomes, it's more dense, when it's cool, and then it will get heated, it's going to come up. And so basically, you have what we see in the mantle of the Earth. Those French names, but you can see the distances down to the center of the Earth. And so you have the crust, and then you go down 5,000 kilometers to where the center of the Earth is. And so what we see is something very interesting. Now this is his, and I'll show this first, and then I'll show you what we've observed. This is the model he did, and he showed that if you put the data in, it actually does show a dropping of the cool matter down to the core. And the energy for this process comes from potential gravitational energy associated with the differences in temperature and density. Now, I think there's some questions about the validity of whether this would really start continents moving at the speed he wants them underwater, and there's some issues with the water when it comes back up. But this is you can see it happen here. So you can see there when he did all the calculations and put everything in, it gave this result. And you can see here how there's a collection of cool matter really, really deep in the Earth. And then the other stuff pushes up on this side, and when it pushes up, it's going to raise, because it's a lighter material, it's going to raise the continental shelf. It's going to come up and out. So the seismic images of the Earth mantle actually show an unexpected ring of cool rock near the bottom of the mantle, mostly associated with the subduction zones around the Pacific Ocean. So you can see here, the blue is the cool, and the red is the higher temperatures. Now, when we talk about cool, we're talking about the difference between 3,000 degrees Celsius and 5,400 degrees Celsius. So everything's hot, but it's cooler, and it shouldn't be there. So Baumgartner's sort of answers this, and Walter Brown answers a different aspect. Maybe there's a combination of the two. We don't know. This is where we are. A lot of people like this. He's worked on this for a long time, and it took. This is data from over 10,000 seismographs put together, showing this deep. So a lot of interesting things about the flood that happened, and of course he would predict that this would come up, and you'd have the hot new seafloor that's forming in these steam jets. So that's where he says this is the fountains of the deep. And these steam jets come up, and then they're higher because they're less dense. And so you get a raising of the continental shelf. Okay. I don't want to bore you all with this, but anyway, it's the latest thing in creation research. Lots of different things. A 1 mile uplift, a 1.6 kilometer uplift. It's interesting that I don't know how they came up to the 1 mile uplift or 1.6, because I know the Grand Canyon is like 1.6. Was a relationship? I don't know. But anyway, it would cause a lot of rain. Now, let's look at fossils and strata. So, we saw the Tapeats sandstone earlier on, this worldwide. So if we see worldwide formations of strata, then there was a worldwide flood. Make sense? Okay, everybody still awake? Sorta? Okay. So this actually covers North America, Israel, and Egypt, the Tapeats sandstone that I've shown here. Okay. And so these are bent horizontal tapeats from the lava canyon. And so you have these different sandstone. And then you can look at the red wall. Now, you guys are more familiar with the limestone because you have the limestone cliffs. Now, that formation actually is in Canada, comes here, goes all the way down, comes out in France, lower France and Germany, goes to India, and actually finishes in Australia. That's a really long, big formation. It's a worldwide formation. And so you have the red wall formation, North America, England, and the Himalayas. And you see that's from the Grand Canyon, where you see these red. It's the red from the iron, right, oxidizing. And here is from Norfolk in England. Sorry, I misspelled England. Norfolk, England. And you see here, this is the white limestone, and the red is underneath it. And this is the same limestone as what we find in the Grand Canyon. So it's a worldwide event. More limestone. North America, Europe, India, Australia is this white, these cliffs, Dover. So we have So we have these massive formations that are worldwide, and that's what we would expect from a worldwide flood. From the worldwide flood. Now, remember our little books with all these 10 different layers, right? Talked about those 10 microfossils. Okay, so those are the ages. When they talk about Jurassic, it's supposed to be 205 million years old, and they say at the bottom you have Precambrian and you have Precambrian. Basically, Precambrian means no fossils. Here you start having the trilobites, they show there, and the Cambrian explosion, and then you start having these. For instance, in Quebec, we have these layers. We don't have any of the others. We say, what happened to them? Oh, they all eroded away and got to the ocean. So we go to the ocean, they're not there either. Oh, well, they got subducted and went under the ocean. Okay, I can't go any further. And then if you go to Nova Scotia, you have the Carboniferous and a bit of Permian, and then you go higher, and then you get to the Alps, you have some of these. Again, you don't have all of this anywhere in one place. However, in the Grand Canyon, you'd think, gee, with all that strata, we must have all of this. But no, that's not quite true. In the Grand Canyon, what you have are actually, okay, these are the different Silurian is supposed to look like this. These are basically, if you really want the truth, if we had a global flood today, what would we expect to find at the bottom in terms of creatures? What would we find at the bottom? Marine, exactly. Fish, well, not too many fish live at the bottom, but you know what I mean. You start with the bottom, and then you build up, and you got the sea, marine environment, and you build up, and eventually you get the amphibians, right? Because that's where they'd be, and you move up. And the ones that move around the most, they're going to be a little bit over the top there because the water's rising, and they're moving away. So you have that, and then you have some mixing associated with density. So that's basically what we see, actually, are these different groups that we would expect to see if we had a global flood in terms of their ecological locale. Now, you don't often have the whole ecology. In fact, in some cases, we have millions, I say millions, not lightheartedly, I mean really millions of dinosaur fossils and no vegetation. You're saying, well, what were they eating? Good question. What were they eating? In fact, I always like how they get rid of the dinosaurs and don't manage to get rid of the frogs. I always wondered how they did that. In fact, I like to ask that to evolutionists. I say, you believe dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago? Yes. How come you got rid of all the dinosaurs but didn't get rid of the frogs? Frogs are really sensitive to environmental modifications. They're environmental indicators. When there's pollution or something, they're the first to get it. How do you get rid of all those dinosaurs but the frogs make it? Never a response to that question. I like questions that don't get a response. Well, what we notice in the Grand Canyon is that we only have 3 layers, the Cambrian, the Carboniferous, and the Permian. They say, well, there's no problem, but there's a serious problem because there's 150 million years missing. So we have the Permian and the Carboniferous and the Cambrian are just one directly on top of the other, and there's 150 million years of the 600 million years that they say the Grand Canyon was formed. That's a lot of missing time. Of course, we saw earlier on the 500 million missing years, but see, it's like you can put a pen. It's missing 150 out of 600 million years. That's a major problem. If you have a model, you're saying that the model is such and such a thing, and it's missing a quarter of the data, and it's not like it's up in the air floating. You have these 2 rock strata are right on top of the other. Even more fun than that. As you walk along in the Grand Canyon, you have, say, A, B, and C, and then B disappears, and you have A right on top of C. What happened to B? What happened to that million years? Just disappeared. And then you walk further, and it flips, and C is on top of A. Yeah. For creationists, that's not an issue. It's flood. But for someone who wants this to happen really slowly, a key being the sedimentation horizontally, slowly from the bottom up, it's a major issue. Okay. So we looked at this nonconformity earlier on, so I won't show it again. The absence of erosional markings by water, as in valleys or gorges in the deep strata of the earth, is fatal for any theory that proposes that each formation rose out of the water to become a habitable surface, right? Because they have in the plate tectonics, not catastrophic plate tectonics, but regular plate tectonics, they have the ocean, they have the continents going down below the water, I think it's 28 times. Well, you know, if you have all the continents going down below the water, isn't that like a global flood? They got 28 of them. I only want 1. And let's continue. We would only ask to find these excavated valleys and formed mountains in the ancient strata of the earth, similar to those that we see in the present. 1905. He said, where's the evidence? Mount St. Helens. Remember I talked about Mount St. Helens earlier on? This is Mount St. Helens actually exploding with a pyroclastic flow. This was extremely hot, very dangerous, of course. A few people died, including a U.S. president that was retired, but he refused to leave. Rapidly formed strata on the North Fork strata. So this here, see the lady here? Okay, this whole thing was formed in 24 hours. So you have this pyroclastic flow, this cloud of dust. It's turbulent. Anything that's turbulent, the heavier particles or more denser particles are going to come out first, then you get the lighter particles. So what you have is a layering happening as this cloud is going down, and it's actually going horizontally. So all these strata are being formed at the same time, this way, not this way. Okay? And you can get this happen, and this happened. I mean, we observed it, 24 hours. one day, and you had the formation of all those different strata. This canyon, spilling from the crater, this is another place, low it falls, reshapes the north slope of the volcano. You'd expect a hard rock canyon to be thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years old, but this was made in less than 10 years. How about fossils? Fossils suggest rapid burial. The shells are similar to modern clams buried in a formation the size of Utah, the size of the state of Utah, 200,000 square miles of clams. You have nautiloids, these here, over here. Now, what's interesting is this is in the Grand Canyon. So these nautiloids are fascinating because not only is it in the red granite, but the nautiloids are all basically facing the same direction. How do you get everybody, and that's from all through 3 states, not just at the Grand Canyon, it goes under Las Vegas, it goes further. How do you do that? How do you get all these nautiloids to just die in the same direction? You don't do it slowly. You do it because they're caught in a current, right? And they're being buried, and they're just lining up because they're straight, so you can't go against the current, so they all get pushed like this and then buried. So this really shows, traditional view is thousands of millions of years, or millions of years old, but it has to be instantaneous. Robert Brahm says, estimates that there are 800,000 skeletal remains of vertebrate animals in the Karoo Formation in South Africa. 800,000. That's a lot of animals. Look at this. Just packed with fossils. It's mostly marine fossils, or all marine fossils. Just packed. We see this everywhere. We see herring in California that's like a kilometer by half a kilometer deep. It's just solid herring. I mean, it's just, the earth before the flood was extremely luxuriant, had immense amount of vegetation. God doesn't know lack. It does not exist in his character. It's not in his nature. He doesn't compute with lack. Our whole financial system is based on lack. The less there is, the more valuable it is. But God doesn't work that way. He works with Solomon, and Solomon's silver becomes worth nothing. It's put in dung piles outside the city. God, he uses gold as asphalt. Right? He doesn't know lack. It's good to know that we have a God that can provide for our needs, who doesn't know lack. Right? These are clams. Remember my little clam here? Little clam? How about this clam? This clam, amongst others that are around here, is 3.5 meters wide, okay? And it's 2 miles above sea level in the Andes Mountains. Now, oysters aren't really known as being alpinists, right? As being really good candidates for climbing mountains. Really not good. You know, their little feet aren't just going to do it, especially not if you like that. Now, I always want to know what the pearl is like in there. Don't know. Pretty good sized pearl if there was a pearl. But that would mean the Andes were underwater. A lot of interesting things in the Andes. Think how fast this fossilization, this fish, this plesiosaur, is ichthyosaur, is actually giving birth, and it's flash fossilized while it's giving birth. That's not a slow fossilization. This one is a fish eating a fish. It's either a fish eating a fish, or the other fish is actually pushed into its mouth because of the event. Whatever the situation, it's clearly not a slow event. Clearly a very fast event. Okay, all sedimentary rock. How long does it, because remember, all fossils are made in water, right? How long is this insect supposed to survive without degradation with water? How about this? Anybody recognize what this is? Butterfly. Dragonfly with a wingspan of 60 centimeters. It's a huge wingspan. But how long, again, here, look at the preservation. It's phenomenal preservation. Very quick. A leaf. So what are we talking about? Really fast preservation. Here's in Joggins where we have these forests where I show there's this tree, polystrata tree. There's all kinds of things here that we notice. Upright. We even found one that's upside down. That shows the tree was brought. So they said, "Oh, this is a forest." Well, then how can you get a forest with an upside down tree? You can't. Now, the next thing we notice that's global is planation surfaces, global planation surfaces. And we don't have enough time, so I didn't put all the slides in. But what we see is there are mountains around the world, this is Montana, where the tops of the mountains are simply taken off. So you have the mountain formation, and water, it obviously wasn't this high at the time, but water comes along in another event and wipes off the tops of the mountains. That is a lot of water. These are mountains. You understand this? The Rocky Mountains. These are called planation surfaces. They're all over the world. Sometimes they call them tabletop mountains. Everything's cut off, and it's flat, completely flat. Flat as this stage. Look at this, Square Top Mountain in Wyoming. Everything's just cut off at the same height. Whoop. This is in Wyoming also, another flat top mountain. This is in Venezuela. There are many, many flat top mountains in Venezuela, and this is one of the more spectacular ones. It's more than 400 meters high, the cliffs are. And just flat, it's like 18 square kilometers at the top. Some event happened over these mountains, just cut the tops off them. I remember I was in South Africa in Durban, and just outside Durban, you can see a tabletop mountain. You have this mountain, and whoop, it's just flat at the top. There's no top to the mountain. Well, this is clearly and because of a worldwide event we're looking at, worldwide phenomena, it must be a worldwide event here. We're looking at mountains just having their tops taken off. Yeah. Now, who believes in a worldwide flood? Well, a lot of scientists do. Kurt Wise, Austin, these are a whole list of Danny Faulkner. Many of these people I know or knew. Some are dead, but some aren't. And so you can't say that there are scientists that don't believe in global flood. There's lots of scientists that do. Obviously, it's not in the majority of scientists, but there are many well-qualified scientists that do believe in a worldwide flood. Now, summary of the evidence. The geologic column is a model not found in anywhere. The large canyons can form rapidly. Remember, we saw the canyons that formed 10 years, and we also saw the stratified rock that was formed in just 24 hours. Thin layers of sedimentation do not require long ages. I didn't have time to get into turbidites and liquefaction and Mount St. Helens we talked about. Coal and oil and petrified wood can occur rapidly. There's no need for long ages. All right, so let's talk about Jesus and the global flood. You guys still awake? Everybody ready? We're getting toward the end. Was it interesting so far? Was it worth missing the race duck? I feel sorry for you. Okay. And now you're all going to start talking with a Canadian accent, right? Yes? No? I don't think so. Okay. The word in Genesis, you have God's covenant, right? It's associated with the flood, right? The covenant not to re-flood the world, right? Associated with the rainbow. Now, the word used, mabul, is used only of the flood and only found in Genesis chapter 6 and 11 and in Psalms 29:10. And the word kataklosmas only occurs 4 times and always refers to a flood. So the words used in Hebrew clearly refer to a flood, massive flood, and it's only used in these contexts. Peter describes the flood as global in 2 Peter 2:5 and 3:3-6, and we'll talk about that in a second. Jesus confirmed the flood in Matthew 24:37-39 and in Luke 17:26-27. And the words used for the flood, you have Genesis, as I said, Mabul, and in Matthew, in Greek, it's kataklosmos, which is probably badly pronounced, but anyway. So you have these different verses. Let's go take a look at, I'm not going to look at all of them, but let's take a look at, Jesus says, Matthew 24:37-39, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days they were before the flood. So he's obviously talking about a real flood and a real Noah. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark, he believes in a real ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Keep in mind, one of the issues we have with the flood story is that we put Noah's ark in a cartoon thing, and then we have like Mr. and Mrs. Noah and a giraffe and a rabbit. And everybody's, hi. Okay, let's get the scene right now. Noah has preached. Noah is the world's worst evangelist. He preached for 120 years. He's the most perseverant evangelist. He preached for 120 years, and nobody got saved. Nobody accepted to come on the ark. I'd be sort of depressed personally. I'm sorry. I don't know how Noah did it. 120 years. But he built that ark. He knew what God was telling him. The animals come in, but his friends are helping. He probably subcontracted some of the work on the ark. I'm sure they weren't just 8 building that boat. They subcontracted and paid out and got people helping, but those people, they weren't coming on the ark. No, that's stupid. Ark. They got this big dream boat here, big as the Queen Mary II, up on land. There's no water near here. You are out of it. We'll get paid. We'll do the job, but we're not getting on any boat. All the animals start coming. You would think they'd start thinking when animals start showing up from all over the world. You know, Noah didn't go get them. They showed up on their own. You would think someone would be smart enough to say, this is not normal. Maybe Noah, what did he say in that cassette number 5? What did he say? Okay, or CD number 5, whatever. Well, they didn't have cassettes or CD. So, the animals get on the boat. Now, what the Bible says is that God closed the door. I suspect Noah didn't want to close the door. He tried for 120 years. He was giving it his all. God closes the door. It starts raining. Okay. Takes a few days for the rain to start rising. Starts rising. They've seen flood before. Let's just move upland. It's still moving up. Let's move up some more. This isn't looking good. We have no more fields to eat. Noah, he's got a boat. I think we should go there. So they run up and they start knocking. And Noah and his wife can't do anything. They didn't close the door. My feet are wet. I'm around waist deep. His friends, his people he knows. It's getting more and more desperate because they're starting to tread water. Until I don't think Noah and his wife were laughing as the last knocks were heard and they could do nothing. A man who'd spent 120 years trying to get people into the boat, and now they wanted to come into the boat, and it was too late. Did they eat? They did eat, they drank, they married wives, and were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. Yeah, destroyed them all. What a time. So then you have events, of course, the dove. This is very important, you know. If we look at the flood and we look at water baptism, in the flood, a world that is corrupt due to sin is covered with water. It's the judgment of God. In water baptism, a sinner puts their confidence in Christ for salvation and is covered with water. That's the whole thing about immersion. The ark lifted those that believed out of the water, salvation. The believer in Christ is lifted out of the water, right? After the beginning of the flood, it rained 40 days, 40 nights. After the baptism of Jesus, he goes what? He goes and fasts 40 days and 40 nights. After the flood, a dove indicated to Noah that he could return to solid earth. The dove left, never came back. Remember that? Okay. Interesting. After the baptism of Jesus, the Spirit of God comes down on Christ in the form of a dove. The dove returned. Very important that we have a real worldwide flood for understanding our theology. See, John the Baptist, when he was baptizing, he wasn't baptizing to salvation. He was baptizing associated with the flood and the judgment of God. You were repenting, and you were repenting of your sins, and you were coming out of the waters of the flood. In fact, 1 Peter mentions this, which sometimes were disobedient when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls saved by water. The like figure whereunto even baptism does also now save us, not the putting away of the filth of flesh, but the answer of a good conscience towards God by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So clearly, Peter is relating baptism to the flood. Okay? And this, we're going to finish with this. Peter was a prophet. We don't really associate, we associate Peter with preaching and the evangelist and the one who really spearheaded the primitive church. But Peter was a prophet, and this is one place where he was definitely into prophecy, and that's in 2 Peter 3:3-6. He said, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days, which I believe we're in, scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? When's he coming back? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. That's uniformitarianism. That's everything is the same, never changed over time, no catastrophes. Then he says something very interesting. He says, for this they willingly are ignorant of. Willingly being ignorant, that means they tell lies. Okay? They are deceivers. That, three things. One, by the word of God, the heavens were of old. The heavens were created by the word of God, not by a big bang. Right here. Two, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. The earth was created from water. And we can get into that. I don't have time right now, but we can get into the planets. There's some very interesting things about the planets coming out of water. And three, whereby, water, the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. He's talking about the world that then was destroyed by the flood. He says in the last days, people are going to deny three things. That God created the heavens with his word. They're going to deny that water was ever involved. And they're going to say there never was a flood. I think we've hit all three criteria for over 100 years. We must really be in the last days. And he says, the reason for this is in the next verse. But the heavens and the earth, which now are now, this is verse 7 to 10, which now by the same word are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. In other words, God isn't going to destroy the earth with water. Fire is coming. And he says this is what's coming. And this is why they don't want to look at what happened to the water in the past, because they don't want to look at the fire in the future. They don't understand the love of God and they don't want to receive it. But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. In other words, God runs time. And the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, but some men count slackness, but is long-suffering, he's patient to us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. That is how important the flood is. If we take the global flood of the Bible, we've taken a great deal of our theology out of the Bible. And yet, anybody who denies the six-day creation denies the global flood. And that is a great deal of our churches today, because they've tried to compromise, as I mentioned in the article. They've compromised with the world, and they should never have. They should never have. These are heavy words, right? They're heavy words. What I said towards the end as I wrap up here, I got 1 minute. As I said towards the end, Noah, he's on this ark, and he loses all his friends. The consequence of sin is ghastly. It's not something to be laughed at or taken lightly. Jesus had to die on the cross. The judgment of God is real. And though we have to be balanced with our message associated with the judgment of God, and not forget that there's the grace of God, right? That's the whole point of Jesus. But the judgment of God is real. And if we are not under the grace of God, we are under the judgment of God. And Jesus wanted people to come to me, all you that are heavy laden, because my load is light. They're heavy laden because they know they're under judgment. To try to get out of judgment, they try to deny the flood. They try to deny that God created things. They make up cosmologies that have nothing to do with reality. They try to deny that the strata were made in just a few days and say that they're made in millions of years. They create all these fables and run to them to try to avoid the feeling of that heaviness of the fact that they've been disobedient to the Creator and they know it. That's where we come in. There are, Jesus said the fields are ripe. Everything's there. God wrote his law in his hearts. They know they're sinners. They just need to know the answer, how to get out of this issue. And if we can get them free of the delusion that some people have set up, then they say, that's a great idea. I was in Nice in France, and I'd given a talk on evolution, creation, the truth. And during the question and answer period, there's a gentleman, never been a Christian. He said, who is this God? After asking a few questions, he said, who is this God? That is where the discussion should lead. Who is this God? And I pray that you all have the opportunity to use some of this information and to be able to have conversations with people in love where they'll come to that question. Who is this God. God bless you.